So, Alex, when we work with foster carers or even primary or secondary school teachers, and they're trying to understand the types of behavior that we see with children who've had adverse childhood experiences or they've had previous trauma, we use a framework of which is based on that Kaplan Wheeler assault cycle that we see around in the health sector and so on. But a lot of people outside of healthcare haven't seen it. And it starts off with something called the baseline phase. So I know you have some thoughts on that. Maybe we could ask you to tell us what do we mean when we see a child's behavior and we describe that as the baseline?
So baseline would be the behavior that you see the majority of the time. And again, certainly with someone who has and it's a horrible phrase, a normal lifestyle, then their baseline is based around the routines and habits they have day to day. It's at a certain time you do a certain thing, you're at a certain place, you're stood a certain way, you're wearing a certain set of clothes. And baseline is that it's for want of a better word, it's the normal. And then we see anything going outside of baseline as potentially the start of behaviors that need to be managed.
And for me, one of the key things that I always love to describe when we show people what the cycle looks like, and then we talk about the baseline phase, is I like to describe that as the phase that the child's in when they're coping with what's going on. And so
Yeah.
they're deploying the coping strategies that they have for the things that are happening normally. And they have coping strategies for that. And those two concepts kind of go together is that I'm at my baseline when I'm able to cope. But then something happens that's out of the normal or that challenges something that's stable, and you're into the triggering phase. And the way we describe that, of course, is that now the child's not coping.
Right. When we look at a triggering phase and any sort of trigger, it's any stimulus that is perceived and then goes in, or it's an unperceived subconscious event which builds up over time. So either way, you've got something that's going to sit there, and it'll either have immediate action. So we go through the trigger phase, the trigger is initiated, and then we see an elevation, arousal and behavior starts to go up. Or if we see it in the long term, then we see someone who is uncomfortable with something but doesn't know why. And then that takes a much longer time, but it has a much longer release of the sort of hormones leading to the sort of behaviors that we see. So we see gradual build-ups because of that, which is an interesting thing again, because um, sometimes getting people to accept that their eyes are always open, their ears are always on, their sense of smell is always there, and that our brain as a pattern recognizing machine is always processing that information against former patterns, which is former baselines. So as soon as that trigger happens, then you can have an immediate or you can have a long-term gradual triggering. And it's getting people to understand that, getting our carers and our teachers to understand that. That's the key for that one.
The images I like to use for that is we always talk about the adrenaline dump, because you and I are always talking about, instant action where at the point of impact, a member of staff or a carer turns a corner and there's, crazy stuff going on. But I think when we talk about these kinds of scenarios in home life or in school life, then the imagery is maybe sometimes we need to think about an adrenaline drip
Yeah.
and a dripping of adrenaline that happens over a period of weeks or months or even longer that that eventually fills up a bathtub full of adrenaline, and that has to go somewhere. So not to underestimate the dripping of adrenaline, I think is one key message there, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, certainly when we look at how people are triggered and what it is that causes someone to trigger, one of the key aspects is always getting people to relate to their own, getting people to acknowledge their own triggers, so they can empathize with other people's triggers is a key point when we're training. And some of the triggers I've had in training are absolutely fascinating, because I don't want them to be just from the context of teaching or from fostering. I want them to give me a genuine trigger that hits them. And the subjects that come out are things like driving, um, rudeness, from people who are serving them in a shop, for example. One the other week about garages, being made to wait because the guy who's behind the counter is on the phone. Things like that, and
I spoke with a team. I spoke with a team recently who I actually asked them about specific phobias or pet hates or even situations that they would do anything to avoid.
right,
And we came up with some really interesting things there, including one gentleman who really, really can't stand balloons.
right,
He's not afraid of them. He gets angry about balloons. So I'll
right.
leave that there. But I think just to reinforce your point, it's so interesting to get people to admit to explore and then admit to the little things that have a disproportionate effect on their behavior. Because then, as you say, they might just be a little more forgiving and understanding of other people when they're triggered.
From my own research, the fascinating thing is that every 10 years you add approximately 1,000 triggers, sometimes more, and you probably dump a couple of hundred. So the rate is huge in generation of triggers, but not in getting rid of them. And again, fascinating thing about triggers, how do you get rid of a trigger? Well, it's an acceptance exercise. You accept your response to it and you decide that that's no longer going to be your response, whether that's an overt or internal process. And again, we're on the pathway to fear and all sorts of things there as well, which we'll cover on a separate sort of day. But so we're looking at triggers, we're looking at short and long term, we're looking at people relating to it so they can empathize and understand, which is the key. Because the worst place for anyone to ever be in a challenging situation is not trying to understand the other person's perspective. Because without it, then I would simply feel completely unrelated to that person stood in front of me. If they have care over me and I feel they can't relate, then that will introduce all sorts of other factors as well. I won't feel that they're able to provide the care that I need. I'll be uncertain about where we're going. And when we look at the scarf model in itself, the one at the bottom, the last one, I will see it as unfair simply because you're not being part of this transaction. I'm telling you something you can't understand it, therefore it's not fair.
Yeah, I think we use the language of the scarf model a lot in our discussions because it's such a great way of it's five domains: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, created by David Rock and published by him in a number of his books and some journal articles that he was involved in. And for me, the relatedness domain is really, really key for these children who are in foster care or who are living in care anyway. Because for me, the definition of relatedness is the first level definition is how safe do I feel with you?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
if I feel safe with you, then that defines me feeling related to you. So, but the second level, and maybe a more complex definition of it is how sure can I be that you are seeing this situation from my point of view and understand my needs? And it's a really long definition, but it's how sure can I be that you understand me is the definition of
Yeah.
relatedness. And if it's
And
not
it,
there, I don't feel safe.
that's right. And we all want someone in another interaction to empathize with us because it leads to more successful interactions. And that boils down to this whole minimum effort, minimum energy expenditure thing that we are as a human. If you and I can have a conversation for 10 minutes rather than 2 hours, simply because you can see my perspective and I can see yours, then that's productive all round. Certainly, when I've been speaking to fosterers, one of the key things that you see, is certainly with teenagers, is impatience in communication. And that's because there's two levels I would look at. The first one is if they're adrenalized, then obviously they've had a frontal lobe lobotomy, and there's no glucose and no oxygen in the frontal lobe, so high language is not going to happen. And they expect you to understand meaning from short phrases and short syllables. And again, when we look at it that way, if I can empathize, then they don't need to bring themselves down just yet, and they can emote, which is a key point. With every aspect of dealing with challenging behaviour, if someone is exhibiting aggression, if someone is exhibiting anger, frustration, then first of all, it might not be you that's the trigger. They may have transferred that emotion to you. And in a way, it's good for the carer, because when you can have someone transfer an emotion over, it means they trust you. When we look at kids who've had a bad day at school but have not acted up at school, it's because they didn't feel safe to act up at school. So they bring it home, and then they feel safe and confident that I'm not going to get hurt here, so I can become angry and I can emote in front of dad, in front of the foster carer, in front of certain teachers, even, simply because I'm in a safe place with someone I trust.
Yep, it's a huge point. And some of these children that we're talking about have had such difficult beginnings in life and sometimes really traumatic incidents that they've been involved in and events that they've witnessed or experienced themselves, that they will find it really difficult to actually feel safe with an adult or with a particular, if I could say, kind of adult, somebody in authority, somebody who's male, somebody who's female.
Mm.
And that whole point you made about coming home from school and feeling safe, if I had a pound, and I probably do, for every time a foster carer has said to me that it seems that they hurt the ones they're closest to.
That is what emotional transference is. You find yourself in a situation where you've been triggered, you are heightened, you're aroused, but because of where you are, you don't feel safe. Because of peer pressure, you don't feel you can emote. So therefore, you take yourself away to a safe space, or when you get to a safe space, somewhere you feel you can, then you will emote with someone who you trust to not hurt you. And certainly, with the foster carer situation, and looking at it from that perspective, it's the story every time. Uh, they're at school. There's peer pressure. There's an environment they don't feel safe in, and then what they do is they just store up that anger, that aggression, whatever it is, frustration, and then when they get home and they feel safe, it's like they walk through the door, they take a deep breath, and then bang, and it's purely because they feel that they're safe to do it without getting hurt.
And for me, and this crosses over between foster care and schools, and we often get asked to help, for example, secondary schools with incidents of behavior where they think maybe they need to do physical intervention. So we get these calls to go and help a secondary school with issues of physical violence. And when we get there, often when we talk to staff, it's simply a matter of making sure the staff can allow the child to remove themselves from the audience and the peer pressure that they're feeling. So that's one thing. If we then just switch tracks for a minute and look at the children who do struggle at school and who are looked after, they have a baseline kind of feeling of shame.
Yes.
They know they're different. They know that they have a different life from other people. They don't have the same family life. And maybe their peers don't give them a break for that ever. And so whenever the spotlight is on them in a classroom or in a public or community sort of environment, they feel deeply that they're already starting from behind. They're already
Yeah.
behind the curve. And so those feelings of shame are just multiplied tenfold in a public environment. And maybe when the door shuts and they're at home and they're with the foster carer, who of course understands where they're coming from and what their situation is, maybe that's what makes them feel safe enough to unload.
Absolutely. And it's when we're talking to carers, foster carers, the key thing there is to get them to understand that's a bridge of trust that's now developed, because I feel safe enough to behave this way, to emote with you. Trust is one of those fascinating things that you have to give before you get. It's similar to respect. You have to give respect before you get respect. Well, it's the same thing with trust. And again, if I've been a foster carer for 20 years, then every single child is unique. So I have to be able to reset and come back to, right, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to give trust, we're going to give respect, and set that playing field early, and then hopefully develop it. And again, this is where I really admire them for their patience, because they understand that these are processes that don't take a day, they don't take a week. These are processes that take months and years. Especially if we're looking at trauma, a child with trauma, to modify their behaviour, we're looking at a safe baseline that exists for a very long time and is delivered in a positive way so that they don't then re-trigger constantly. Again, with the Kaplan and Wheeler, the physiological effects of having that constant triggering, going into crisis, coming down, and there's only so long you can do it before immune system is compromised, all these sorts of things. So these long-term effects is all about setting a safe baseline and then building that trust over time so you have less of these incidents.